Welcome back to Intro to Religion, PHL 1030. We're going over Tim Bain's book, Philosophy of Religion, a very short introduction. In this video, we're going over Exam 1, Part A, Question 6. Compare William James's attitude of tentative venture, Soren Kierkegaard's passion of inwardness, and St. Thomas Aquinas' demand for certainty regarding faith in God. Which seems least plausible and which seems most plausible to you? Why? So this is on pages 60 to 63. Okay, so in the previous video we went over W.K. Clifford's claim that it is immoral everywhere and always for anyone to believe anything without sufficient evidence. And with that in mind, on page 60, we're going to discuss William James, an American religious thinker. He lived from 1842 to 1910. He provided what many regard as an attractive alternative to Clifford's conception of the ethics of belief. James pointed out that we have two aims when it comes to belief. Not only do we want to avoid error, which is what Clifford focused on, we also want to obtain the truth. So about that, William James says, our errors are surely not so awfully solemn things. In a world where we are so certain to incur them, in spite of all our caution, a certain lightness of heart seems healthier than this excessive nervousness on their behalf. So Clifford was excessively nervous about evidence for belief, William James is implying. And he also compared Clifford's attitude to a general who holds his soldiers back from a fight for fear of losing any of his soldiers. Well, you won't win the war that way. You might not incur any losses in the short term, but you might lose the whole war if you never go to battle. And so, regarding faith in God, what would be the criteria for believing in something without sufficient evidence? So here's what James says, that sometimes faith is required. And here are the three criteria on page 61. First, the proposition in question must be a live one. In other words, it must recommend itself to the person as a serious candidate for the truth. Second, the proposition must be momentous. It must matter. Third, it must be a forced option. There must be no genuine possibility of suspending belief on the matter in question. So William James says religious questions, the existence of God, meets all three criteria. It's a live question. It's important. It's momentous. And he says we really can't choose to suspend belief. Some people claim I'm agnostic. William James is saying, well, you should make up your mind one way or the other, at least tentatively. And this is the big difference between William James and Thomas Aquinas and Kierkegaard, who say faith should be absolute, not tentative. Here's another quote from William James. We cannot, he says, escape them by remaining skeptical, these questions that are so momentous and forced upon us. For, quote, although we do avoid error in that way if religion be untrue, we lose the good if it be true, just as certainly as if we positively chose to disbelieve. That's a variation of Pascal's wager. You should wager that God does exist, because if God doesn't exist, you lose nothing in comparison to the infinite reward you gain if God does exist. So you have everything to gain and nothing to lose, so it's only reasonable to wager that God does exist. But the nature of the belief that James recommends, at least according to Tim Bain's, is tentative. On page 61, he says, instead of taking James to provide an account of when it is permissible to believe in God's existence, one could instead read him as giving an account of when it is appropriate to accept that God exists. What is the difference between belief and acceptance? Roughly speaking, belief in a proposition involves a categorical endorsement of its truth, whereas accepting it involves only a willingness to assume its truth for certain purposes. And he mentions a scientist and a detective. You have a hypothesis, you guide your actions by that hypothesis, but you're willing to change the hypothesis if the evidence points to another hypothesis. So perhaps neither the scientist nor the detective would claim that to believe their respective hypotheses, but they do use these hypotheses to guide their actions. The picture of faith that James paints for us involves a certain tentativeness. Okay, so contrasting to that tentative belief in God with an escape clause attached, we have Thomas Aquinas and Soren Kierkegaard. So I'll read Kierkegaard first, then I'll go back and read Aquinas. So Soren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher, lived from 1813 to 1855. Kierkegaard objected, this is page 62, Kierkegaard objected to the idea that religious belief should be based on an objective weighing of the evidence, for it is, quote, precisely in objective analysis that one loses the infinite personal and passionate concern that is the requisite condition for faith. So Kierkegaard goes on to say that we have to have this passion of inwardness. Faith, Kierkegaard says, is precisely the contradiction between the infinite passion of the individual's inwardness and the objective uncertainty. If I am capable of grasping God objectively, I do not believe. But precisely because I cannot do this, I must believe. If I wish to preserve myself in faith, I must constantly be intent upon holding fast the objective uncertainty so as to remain out upon the deep over 70,000 fathoms of water, still preserving my faith. So, this is, when I was just reading that, this struck me as problematic. He says, if I am capable of grasping God objectively, I do not believe. But precisely because I cannot do this, I must believe. Well, if you can grasp God objectively, I think when he says, I do not believe, he's saying, you don't believe because you know. I don't believe that to be the truth. I know it's a truth because there God is, but I have to believe that God exists if I don't see him. I'm assuming that's what that means. So that faith is more powerful than seeing God face to face. That doesn't require faith, and faith must grasp, yes, it is objectively uncertain that God exists, and yet I nevertheless believe in God infinitely. I have zero doubt about God's existence, regardless of whatever lack of objective proof that I might have. All right, now I'll go and read from St. Thomas Aquinas, who believed you could gain reasonable proof for the existence of God just using natural human reason and analyzing the structures of nature. We talked about natural theology in previous videos, so this is how St. Thomas Aquinas defines faith in Summa Theologica. He says on page 56, in faith, the intellect assents to something, not through being sufficiently moved by its proper object, but through an act of choice, whereby it turns voluntarily to one side rather than to the other. And if this be accompanied by doubt and fear of the opposite side, there will be opinion. While if there be certainty and no fear of the other side, there will be faith. So Tim Bain says we'll call this the doxatic view. Doxa is the Greek word for belief or opinion. So an intellectual assent. There's not proof, but I'm looking at the evidence here, and I assent to one side. God exists. Now, if I have fear that maybe God doesn't exist, then I am of the opinion that God exists, although I still fear maybe it'll be proven later that God does not exist. But if I say, here's the evidence, and I choose to believe that God exists, and I have zero fear that I'm chosen incorrectly, then that's faith. So 100% certainty in a belief for which we don't have sufficient objective evidence. That is what Aquinas calls faith. I think Tim Bain brings up some interesting questions about that. One of them is, he says, can you really choose to give an intellectual assent? Can you choose to believe anything, or doesn't belief just kind of happen to you? On the bottom of page 56, he says, there are many things that one can do to influence what one believes. For example, one can choose to pursue one line of inquiry rather than another, but belief as such does not seem to be under voluntary control. Intellectual assent seems to be something that happens to us rather than something that we do. But if that is right, then it isn't meritorious, and we are no more to be praised or blamed for our beliefs than we are for the circulation of our blood or the smooth running of our kidneys. So I think that's interesting. Can you choose to believe anything you want? I thought about this for a lie detector test. If you could choose to believe whatever you want, can you choose to believe a lie? I think it's interesting. I'll just bring this up. This is something from who was the author of? From Mark Twain. I'm looking for the page just for. Can you choose to believe a lie? And Tim Bain quotes Mark Twain. He says, "Faith is believing that which you know ain't so." So, is it really possible to believe something that you know is simply false? Someone who could do that would be able to commit all kinds of crimes and then take a lie detector test and then convince themselves that they didn't do it. That would be a pretty powerful tool. An actor would be the best actor in the world. If you can choose to believe a lie, I choose to believe I am the character I'm pretending to be, well, that would be a great actor. Can you choose to believe in God, or does it just happen? Is it grace, a gift from God? So in giving your intellectual assent, but choosing to believe that which you know ain't so, that's an extreme form of faith. St. Thomas Aquinas says you need to use reason to analyze your own thought structures and the structure of nature, and that there's a lot of evidence for the existence of God. So there is a lot of evidence. Maybe it isn't decisive, but at that point, faith isn't just believing what you know isn't true. It's believing what you think is most likely true, although you can't be certain based on the objective evidence, but you are certain because you have faith. That is what Aquinas calls faith. So now I'll go back to where Tim Bain summarizes the issue between William James's tentative venture, Soren Kierkegaard's idea of this infinite inwardness of belief despite all objective evidence, and Aquinas's demand for certainty but with evidence. So on page 63, what should we make of these two lines of criticism? Kierkegaard is certainly right to note that there is a tension between the disinterested weighing of evidence and passionate commitment. At the same time, one might argue that where evidence is altogether neglected, then faith is no longer laudable, but becomes a matter of irrationality, superstition, and gullibility. Aquinas, for his part, is surely right to emphasize the centrality of certainty and resoluteness to the life of faith, but one might ask whether these attitudes are appropriate given the ambiguity that surrounds religious issues. Sure and unshakable conviction may be warranted when the case for a claim is so overwhelming, but one might argue that James's attitude of tentative venture is more appropriate when the evidence is patchy, as it seems to be with respect to matters theological. Okay, so I've gone over those three opinions, and it will be up to you to answer the question, which I will now read again. And this is Exam 1, Part A, Question 6. Compare William James's attitude of tentative venture, Soren Kierkegaard's passion of inwardness, and St. Thomas Aquinas' demand for certainty regarding faith in God. Which seems least plausible and which seems most plausible to you? Why?